So here we go. This is my Gate 3 interview questions for Asbury University. So I'm going to start reading and answering our questions. So first one. How are you prepared to teach the content in your areas of licensure? One, to start, all of the courses that I've taken with Asbury have prepared me for this moment, and passing all of my courses has prepared me for this moment and getting ready for student teaching and teaching in general. The praxis exam has proven that I know my material is what I need to teach the students, and I know the skills needed to teach some of my students. Make sure I'm reading this right. Also, with this, my student teaching has greatly opened up my eyes to the realm of teaching and the area and field of teaching more than I ever would have thought. There's things that I've learned just from being in the classroom, working with actual students, watching the teacher as she works with the students, the things that she says to them, the classroom management skills that she uses with the students, how she teaches lessons. All those things have greatly impacted me and got me closer to being where I need to be for teaching. Next question. Okay. How do you get to know all the academic, social, emotional, and physical needs of your students? To start, for the academic needs, those are discovered and found. Hold on, I want to make sure I'm reading the question correctly. Okay, we understand those and learn the needs of our students academically through assessments. Specifically, sometimes our pre-assessments. When we get ready to go into a lesson, or when I was getting ready to go into a lesson with my students on recycling one time, I did just a real brief pre-assessment with them. I asked just a couple questions at the start of the class. I started with, who in the classroom, recycles at home? Some of them, they raised their hands, some of them didn't. And then I asked, can any of you explain to me what recycling is? And nobody was really able to give a substantial answer. So from there, I knew that I needed to start from the very basics of explaining, what it is to recycle, what it is to reuse things, and what it is to reduce waste. And then from there, I went into teaching the lesson of, we can recycle, different items. Some things we can reuse or give them to Goodwill for someone else to use, something like that. And we can reduce waste by using different means of, just different means in general, like, using a metal water bottle instead of plastic ones all the time. So that would be where we get our academic needs. For the social, emotional, and physical needs, most of that we learn through our relationship with the students. When I begin to know my students personally, when I ask them questions about their home life, when I ask them how their game went over the weekend, for the sport they played, and I begin to make that relationship with them and learn who my students are, then I can meet their social and emotional needs. And also their physical needs. And then sometimes their physical needs can just be met by, for lack of better words, visual cues. I could tell my student would need a new pair of shoes because the pair he has are completely just tore up and just nasty looking, and he's wore the same shoes over and over and over and over. So then at that point I would know, well, we need to work towards getting him a new pair of shoes through the Family Resource Center office. So, next question. How will you determine what to teach and when to teach it? To start, if the school has a curriculum map, which most of them do now, I would go from our curriculum map, find our standards for the lesson plan or the lesson in order, the standards from the curriculum map, and then start planning my lessons. The school I'm working with right now, we use Eureka Math for the first graders. And Eureka Math is a curriculum map that, lays out the standards and some different ways of how they want you to teach the subject and the objectives. So that's one way we learn and determine what to teach and when to teach it. Also, we know what to teach more specifically in the beginning of a lesson through our pre-assessments. We know what our students know from that pre-assessment when we get into the lesson. And even in the middle of the lesson, we take some formative assessments like a small exit slip or a little quiz of some sort or a little game, something, a little worksheet that from that we know if our students have begun to grasp the information that we've given them or if we need to go into that again and do some recap. Next question. How do you match teaching strategies and resources with learning materials? All right, I want to make sure. How do you match teaching strategies and resources with learning materials? First thing, with knowing my students, having that relationship and beginning to know them, I'll know how I need to go about teaching them any lesson plan that we go about in the classroom. When I know that if my students are visual learners, I know, well, we need to maybe watch a little video or do a brain pop. If I know my students are hands-on learners, I would find a way to have materials that we can do that are hands-on. Like for a science lesson one time with my students, we were discussing sound. I had a spoon, or I used a fork, almost like a tuning fork, and I had them smack it against the table and get it up to their ear so they could hear the zzz from that fork, because I knew some students, they're hands-on. They need to learn from that hands-on experience. If I know they're auditory, sometimes it's just I need to talk with them about it. I begin to know their different modalities of learning, and from there, I can start working towards how I need to teach them. Okay. What will you do to ensure high expectations for student learning for all students? Well, in the first 10 days of the classroom, we plan to set the expectations pretty high for what I expect out of them, how I expect them to work, that what they do with their lessons, that I expect the best they can do, all those different things. And then, even then, we set the expectations every time we teach a lesson, what we're wanting them to do, what we're expecting them to learn, how to do from the lesson. And during the lesson, we give our I can statements to them so that they know what's expected. The I can statement, I can label halves and quarters of circles and rectangles. Something like that. And then they know exactly what they're supposed to do with the lesson. Next, how do you ensure there is a solid alignment between your instruction and the assessments? One, we know from the standards and the lesson plan what we're expecting to be assessed from them. So I know what I need to teach them in the first place. I know what I need to tell them, what I need to get them to understand, and for what knowledge I'm expecting them to gain from this. And then the assessment is just to see that they have understood that. And also, in the middle of teaching the lesson, we can assess them, figuring out, if they're starting to get the general concept of the lesson. Next question. How do you create and maintain a climate that is conducive to learning? Again, we have our rules that we lay out from the first 10 days, and we keep consistent with those rules. And then, we also set the expectations for what they're to do every time during the lesson. The other day, I worked with my students, and we went through a math lesson. And the first thing I made sure I did before we taught anything else was that I set the expectations. I expect you to sit in your seat quietly with the little template in front of you, ready to draw and write as I work with you. I expect when someone's being called on that you're not shouting answers, but that you raise your hand and that you're quiet. I lay out all my expectations that way that the room's just not utter chaos, but that it's got a structure and an order. And when there's that structure and order laid out in the classroom, it's going to have a conductive way of teaching, or the climate's going to be conducive to learning. I'll say it correctly in a second. How will you establish a positive learning culture? Please provide 2 examples. For one, I want to start with, having encouragement in my classroom. I want to make sure that my students know that I encourage them to do their best. And when they do things correctly, I want to give them specific praise. I don't want to give them some just generic, oh, you did a good job. I want to say, I love how that your first topic sentence, I love the way it was so well written, a well-written topic sentence. Something like that. Not just, oh, you did a good job. I want to be specific as to what they did good so that they know I'm doing a great job and they know that I really paid attention to them. Let's see, make sure I'm reading. I also want to have a classroom that I promote, asking questions. I want to make sure that they know they can ask me anything in the classroom. We always say there's no stupid question, but sometimes if we're not careful when a student asks us something, we get a little flustered or a little frustrated. I want to make sure that my students know when they ask me something, we're going to take what they've asked me, even if it's something in the very beginning, we'll go back and explain that and make sure that they're getting to a place that they understand that. And from there, we can go on with the rest of the lesson, and they can grow in knowledge. How will you teach the routines of your classroom and minimize the time for transitions? Again, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to go through our routine very specifically the first 2 weeks of school. I want to make sure that they know what they're doing. So I'm going to say, all right, it's time for this, and we're going to start to move. It's time for this, it's time to move. And also would like to have a schedule on the board, something they can see and read, that they'll know when it's time to go to the next whatever we're doing. Whether if right now we're in our math groups, and now it's time to get ready for our reading lessons or silent sustained reading, they know, okay, I need to start putting away my math materials, getting out my book, and getting ready for SSR. Things like that. I want to have a set routine, and that's what I'll do. We'll have that routine laid out for what they would do in the classroom. What are 2 strategies to assist with the management of student behavior? One of the things that I've learned here lately, and I've been implementing in the classroom I'm in right now, something we use for classroom management, we raise our hand and we say, can I have your attention, please? And at that moment, all the students are supposed to raise their hand, and they'll know to be quiet at that moment because the speaker is getting ready to say something they need to hear. So whenever I'm trying to get their attention, I say, can I have your attention, please? And they begin to stop, and I wait for everybody to have their hand up. That way I know I have their attention, and we're starting to get everything back under control. Also, and that's just, in classroom, but also I would use, there's this new app that has come out. It's called Blooms. It's a classroom management app. And it has a way that you can keep in contact with all of your parents at the same time. And, if I want to send something for all of my parents to say, hey, we are working on this right now. Our students need extra help at home with their homework. I can send that, and I know that all of my students, their parents or their guardians have been sent that text, that reminder. And I also know with that app, I can keep up with everybody. And parents can see when students are doing good or they're not doing so well. And they'll only see their own student when they're given, marks in the classroom for what they did good or wrong that day. What will you do in your classroom that will facilitate a positive learning environment? First, I want to have a well-organized classroom. That it's not a mess. Things are neatly in order. The seats are organized correctly. And, everything is organized in a way that there's not all this confusion about things. Where there's a mess, there's sometimes a lot of confusion. But if everything's just in an organized way, it's going to be conducive to learning. It's going to be, in a way that things are in order. Positive learning environment. I also want to make sure with that I have a well laid out lesson plan, that everything's, in order for what I need to teach, the standards, the procedures, and how I'm going to go through everything, that there's not, I'm not sitting there stumbling over my words as to what I need to say. I have my lesson plan laid out. I'm not confused. And if I'm not confused, my students won't have the opportunity to get confused either. Make sure. Also, with having our procedures and our rules and expectations laid out, I want to be consistent with, correction if it's needed. I want to be also consistent in encouraging our students, saying how well they've done. I want to be consistent in those areas, because when there's consistency, there's no room to guess what's going to happen. You know what will happen because of this. You'll know that if you were not on task, that, during your recess time, like we had to work with a student today that was not on task for a little booklet they had made on chickens. She knew because she wasn't on task at that moment, she had to go work on her little booklet during her recess time. So, being consistent, and this happens with all the students. When they don't do their work, recess time is taken so they can do their work. Because when they're goofing off, they need to know, there's a consequence to being silly when I'm supposed to be doing something serious. Next question. How will you communicate your expectations and learning targets for a given lesson? Again, the first, in the beginning of the classroom, I want to make sure that I mention the learning target right in the beginning of the lesson. When I was talking with my students the other day about, halves and quarters, I mentioned in the beginning what we were going to be doing. I said today we're going to be discussing, the halves and quarters of circles and rectangles. So there wasn't no confusion as to what we was going into. They knew what was happening. I would also like to have my I can statements for the standard for that day or for the couple of days that we're teaching that same lesson. I want them on the board. We'll go through the I can statement so that they know what they're going to be learning from this lesson. All right, here we go. Providing a specific example, how will you give feedback to your students during instruction, and how will questions play a role in your teaching? Tuesday of this week, actually, I was working with students on telling time up to the hour and the half hour. They did up to the hour the day before, and they just breezed through it. They understood it easily. But when we integrated the half hour into the classroom and into the lesson, there was a lot of confusion. And I had a big clock about this big or so that I worked with showing the times, and each student had a little clock about like that they made the times as well themselves, and we checked each other. And certain times during the lesson, if I'd see a student that was having a little bit of trouble with it, they would be the student I would pick for my next question, and I'd have him come up and help me to make the time, set the hands for the time on the big clock. And when there's a little bit of confusion, that was a time for me to talk with them one-on-one. We explained, for instance, why is it 8:30? Well, it's because the hour hand is on the 8, and the minutes hand is half past, and it is on the 6. That would be the time that we sit there and we would take, and from that one question they had, it played a role into teaching them and showing them and helping them to understand more. And even when we was working on that, I would have, if I was working with the clock, I'd also choose another student that I knew that was doing, understanding the concept. I'd have them come up and help the student that was struggling to learn the concept, and they would work together to fix the clock. And then, we would all, yeah, we agree, this is good, or no, I don't, or I'm really not sure. And at that moment, I knew what we needed to do with them. All right, here we go. Based on your experiences, what would be a strategy or two for creating student-centered... Read this correctly. What would be a strategy or two for creating a student-centered classroom? The process of differentiation in itself is going to make a student-centered classroom. Whether my students need hands-on work, a little project, a paper for them to do, different little things like that is going to make a student-centered classroom, where I know that how that student learns and how that student is better to express their knowledge is going to make a huge difference. Not every student is going to do well on a paper test, but some students can do great on a project and show their knowledge that way instead of trying to do a paper test. So when it's possible and when we can do it, I want to have different ways of students being assessed in the classroom. That way that I can know, even though they may not be able to write it on paper, but they can make their poster and explain what they know in another form. What is the purpose of assessment in the classroom? Put it simply, assessment shows us what we know or what the student knows. From our pre-assessments in the beginning of the lesson and beginning of learning that standard, I'll know what the student knows in the beginning and what I need to teach and what I need to work with. And in the middle of the lesson, I'll have some formative assessments that, show me if they're starting to understand the topic or not. Again, the other day, working with the clocks with the students, they were given a little form that had, different little times on it that they had to make the minute hand on the clocks. And some of them was just a blank face clock, no hours, no minute hands. And from there, they had to work on that. And from that formative assessment, I knew which students understood, where the hour hand and the minute hand goes to make 8:30 and which ones didn't. And from there, I knew if we needed to do recap on it some more, or if we could move on to the next part of that standard. And, also after our formative assessments, we have the summative assessment that shows me, at the end of the lesson, at the sum of it all, what they really knew, or what they really learned, and what they grasped and understood from that lesson that we went through. Next question. What do you do when things in a lesson do not go as planned? Provide a specific example from one of your clinical experiences. What do? You reassess and evaluate what you did in that lesson. Look at the things that worked, look at the things that didn't work, and work on fixing the things that didn't work and adjusting them. And then, if you can do it, reteach the lesson. The reason I say if you can do it, there was one time I taught the lesson on recycling, and I knew from the as I mentioned earlier with, the pre-assessment, figuring out what they knew about recycling. That lesson, when I taught it, did not go over well. And I knew that at the point of, when I got to the end of the lesson, and I had a student ask me, what is recycling again? After we went through explaining different things, we watched the brain pop video, and I knew at that moment what I did wrong. And what I had messed up on personally, I could make the K-Tip lesson plan, and I had all the things on it, but I needed my own actual personal set of notes. I tried just using the K-Tip lesson plan. I needed to use what worked for me. So what did I do? I evaluated myself on that, and the next time I taught a lesson, I had my own sheet of paper that labeled everything I was going to do from the beginning to the end, a bulleted list, because that's normally how I teach when I do some things with our young people at the church, and that's what I'm used to. From that, I knew how to work with the students, and when I taught the next lesson, things worked so much more smoothly than the other time. So you reassess what happened, you evaluate, and you reflect and make changes. All right. How do you ensure that your reflection improves your future instruction? Again, you adjust yourself and change what did not work. I taught a lesson for Professor Moffat. She came and observed me. And when I was finished with that lesson, she gave me specific notes of some things that did not go well in that lesson. I took those to heart, and I started working on them personally. What do you need to do to ensure that your reflection improves your future instruction? Look through that, read it, understand where you messed up, and then start working on that area where you messed up from that point on. Professor Moffat mentioned to me that I needed some help with classroom management in that lesson. So from there on, I paid better attention on how to have classroom management. I made sure that I set my expectations. I made sure that, I had, like I said earlier, can I have your attention? But at that school, we use 1, 2, 3 eyes on me. I knew what I needed to do from then on out, and I just enforced that into my life and started practicing that. That is basically how you ensure your reflection is going to improve the future. What is a way that you have effectively recorded and tracked student performance? I did the formative assessment when I discussed with my students on halves and quarters. I gave them an exit slip, and I knew from the exit slip which students understood the premise, which ones did not understand the premise, and some of our students that have a little bit of a special need, I knew if they struggled or if they was having a bad day as well, just from that exit slip that we gave them, that formative assessment. So that's one way. Let me read. I've worked with the ARI, the reading inventory, for one of project last semester with Professor Worthen. So just different ways that we effectively recorded. From that, I knew, the student that I was working with, I knew she could read fluently. But the only problem was she would read through it so fast and read through it with fluency, but she didn't comprehend any of it. She would read through it and go through it as fast as she could, but she didn't understand what she was reading. There was no comprehension of it. So that was one time when I effectively recorded my students' performance. What experiences have you had in communicating with families of your students? Personally, I haven't met very many of my students' parents in my clinical experiences, but I have worked with the school system as a bus monitor and a bus driver, and from those experiences, I know how I need to discuss with my parents what's going on with their child. Whether it was, I need your help with little Tommy. He's having a hard time staying seated on the bus. And, I make myself approachable when I go to meet them. I don't just walk up yelling at them, look, this is what your kid did. I walk up and say, how are you today? I'm Aaron Blakeman. I'm your son's bus monitor. Oh, I'm doing good. And they talk to me a little bit, and I'll say, now, if I can get your help, little Tommy's having a hard time with staying seated. And then from there, from that time of talking and communicating with that parent, the next time I meet them, they start asking me things, and I get the opportunity to say, little Tommy's doing so great on the bus. it's not just me telling them all the bad things that's going on, but I get to, give praise to the parent about their student. I'll get to say, little Tommy was staying seated. He was quiet. He did so great. It was just, he is improved drastically. And parents love to hear when their kids are doing great. They love that kind of thing. How have you collaborated with your P12 peers to grow in your professional development? Well, with some of our courses, when we have a Zoom session, we'll go into a breakout room, and I met with some of my my other peers, and that's, I can't think of the word exactly, but in that mode or realm is where I've met with them, and we've discussed things and we've asked questions of ourselves for things we're teaching. The other day we were in a breakout room, and I was discussing with one of them some of the stuff that was going on in my classroom, and we started discussing, how we could do formative assessments a little differently for our students. We discussed how to better differentiate with our classroom. Different little things that we've talked, and that's helped me a lot because I've seen people that they knew a little more than I did, or I saw people, and they knew a little more than I did, and from there I took their information and applied it to myself. What is the area of growth on your personal growth plan, and how are you improving in this area? My personal growth plan and my goal, I have been working on myself to be better at time management. I've had some struggles with it because I have a lot of things that go on in my personal life, but that doesn't change that I need to make the time I do for my courses. So what I've been working at doing is making sure that every day at a certain time, I try to make sure that I'm doing nothing else. I'll sit down with my laptop or at the desktop computer and I begin to work on assignments. I make sure that I have, I know the dates on my assignments, so I know how far time I can stretch to work on these things. What are the gifts and talents that you bring to the profession of teaching? One of them is my love for children. I have been a student bus monitor and worked in the school system in transportation since I was 16 years old, and I'm 24 now. I love kids. I love them to pieces. There's not hardly a thing that a kid can do to really just agitate me because I love them so much, and I want to see I want to see their lives benefited. I don't want to see them just, in a mess all the time. I want to see them benefiting and growing. Another area that I am extremely patient in some things. I can wait on students. I can be patient with them in the middle of their struggles. I can be patient with them when they're having a hard day, and not really like they're having hard times, that they're sad or something, or they're having a bad day, keeping control of themselves and behaving. I can be patient with them and not lose my cool. I can say, now, look at me. I need you to do this and stay focused. And I can talk with them like that and it not get to a place that's just like utter chaos or I'm out of control when I'm talking to them. All right, next question. What is an example of a time you demonstrated your moral and ethical integrity? Let's see. I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. Sensitivity through interpreting situations, becoming aware of how your actions affect others. I can name one personally, and I don't like how this happened to me, but it did. I was at work during a training, and in the middle of that training exercise, things started to go a little bit wrong, and I was actually behind the wheel of a bus on the interstate, and I got nervous, scared to death of what was going to happen. And my instructor is sitting there and he starts to tell me what I needed to do correctly. And at that point, I'm just on edge because of what just happened. And I let him have it. I did not like cussing him out or anything, but I yelled at him a little bit. And when I finally got myself calmed back down and realized what I did, I couldn't believe I'd done that to him. And the Lord dealt with me on it and said, you need to go talk to him. So the next day, I met up with him in the classroom, in the training room, separate from everybody else. And I spoke with him. I said, sir, I need to talk to you for a minute. I realized yesterday my actions were out of control, and I'm sorry about that. I should not have done that to you. I have better respect for you than that. I was nervous. Because at that point, I realized my actions had affected him, and I had done something wrong to him. And I wanted to make sure that I took care of the issue. So I went and asked him to forgive me and, told him I was sorry, and I meant it. I wish I hadn't have done that. But those things happen sometimes. We need to be at a place that, we're sensitive enough to know I can, know my actions, whether I did something right or wrong, and know that I need to tell somebody if I hurt them and ask them for forgiveness. All right, next question. What is an example of a time you demonstrated your passion for teaching and working with students in the P12 setting? So a contagious love for learning, positive attitude or work ethic, motivation, and engagement of students in the learning process. Today, for instance, I was working with a student, and she has somewhat of a special need. It's not really basically she has a behavioral issue. And knowing she has that going on in her life, her and myself were working on a pamphlet about chickens. And she just didn't want to do anything with it. She was just, no, I'm not going to do it. No. And, I have such a love for learning. I wanted to motivate and help her. So I talked with her. I said, if you'll do this work, I'll do it too. So I grabbed a pamphlet and I began to work with her. And I wrote down things just as much as she wrote down things. When we wrote down 2 facts about chickens, I wrote down two facts about chickens. I wanted her to be engaged and know that I'm engaged in this too, and I'm wanting to help her. What is an example of a time you demonstrated your respect and compassion for people? Caring behaviors, nurturing, advocating, equitable treatment. The capacity to understand intention, motivations, and desires of other people and work effectively with them. Respect and compassion for people. Well, right now in my position, I'm a youth pastor at our church, and most of our students, some of them have come out of some rough home life, and there's been times my wife and I have invited them over to our house numerous times to spend the night to try to help them in the middle of a hard time they're having at home. One of my students had to deal with, losing her dad in a very unexpected way. He passed away of cancer. And she never did get to see him before he passed away, because he didn't want her to see him in that physical condition, because her mother and dad had separated. And, knowing that was going on in her life, there was times we would take her out to do something fun. We'd hang out with her, because I knew at that moment she was having a hard time and was struggling, and I wanted her to know that we cared about her and that we wanted to help her even in the midst of what was going on. I have compassion for people. The other day I seen a man at work. He just looked, best way I can put it, he looked like the wind had been let out of his sails. As just an expression we use. I mean, he just looked like life had hit him hard. And I just asked him, I said, what, you okay? He said, I'm just having a bad week. And I told him, so you don't have to tell me anything about it. And, when I walked off and left him after that, I just began to pray for him that God would help him in the struggle that he's going through. And then I checked on him again later that day to make sure if things were any better or any worse, because I wanted him to know that I cared about what was going on in his life. All right. Almost. What is an example of a time you demonstrated your emotional wellness? Let's see. Self-knowledge, discerning one's beliefs, emotional resilience, stress management. In my own personal life, there's times I've dealt with different struggles that just go on day to day. Jesus said it just plainly. He said, in this life you'll have troubles, you'll have tribulations. So I knew there's going to be problems. I've known there's going to be problems in my life that I've had to deal with. And, when those things come, I go to my stress management. I'll go to Jesus. I'll take my time and I'll pray. I'll take time and I'll get in, the Bible and begin to read on what I'm dealing with, what I'm struggling with. That's my stress management. That's how I relieve some issues. And, sometimes, to relieve a little bit of stress and take a breather, I'll leave the house for a little bit and go do something. Get out of the house for a little while and just get out and breathe for a minute. Sorry about that. Right in the middle of our recording, I had a little bit of a disruption. The last question is, what is an example of a time you demonstrated your spiritual sensitivity and purpose? Living the examined life, discerning one's calling, and developing a personal vision, acting upon one's spiritual vision and call, guiding one's student search for meaning. Sorry. Sorry about that. I know my calling has been with young people since I was 16 years old. Because right after that, I was 17 years old, and God orchestrated that I would be the youth pastor at our church. And, God had worked such a miraculous thing in my life. I desired to see that in our young people's lives. And I knew my calling and I knew my purpose at that moment. And then, from there, I have lived my life in such a way that I want to fulfill that purpose. And, I know there's times, personally, I feel like I'm getting away from, what He's called me to do or what my purpose was supposed to be. And in those moments, I go back to my Bible. And this was just something the other day, and I know this is not normally how we do these, but I'm different. The other day, I was I was realizing I was getting a little bit off of what I needed to be. And I began to pray, and this is the verse I prayed. I said, "But now, O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou art our potter, and we all are the work of thy hand." So when I realize I'm not my vision's getting off, or I'm getting away from my purpose, I begin to say, God, mold my life, change me again. Help me to do what I'm supposed to do. Help me to be what I'm supposed to be. Don't let me lose focus of what you've asked me to do. And I have acted upon my vision and called to youth ministry and to teaching young people as well. I've worked hard with my student teaching and my clinicals to try to help every student and try to learn everything I can from those opportunities. And, from those opportunities, I've learned how to grow and teach and learn and, have my spiritual vision on helping those students, with their educational needs, but as well as their spiritual needs. There's times that a student will ask something. One of my clinicals I did, this has been a couple years ago, a student was having a hard time with a situation at home. He was afraid because his dad was sick with something. So the teacher I was with was a Christian lady. And she asked him, said, "Well, do you want us to pray about it real quick?" So, it was just us and that student. So we prayed with them for a minute that, God would help his dad who was feeling bad. So, I know where my call is. I know what I need to do to help them. And we'll answer this last one. Guiding one student's search for meaning. When we can help them, I want them to know that their life has a purpose, just as well as I know mine has a purpose. And that God has made them for a reason, and He's got a goal in mind for them. And that goal goes beyond, living on planet Earth and having all these great things. But His end goal and purpose, I want you to live with me forever. I want you to be with me. I want to have that relationship with you. I want you to be my child, and I be your God. That's our questions. Thank you very much, and you have a great night.